The sound of gravel crunching under my boots echoed through the still morning air. Dawn light bled through the fog that hung low over the valley. My grandfather's valley. Or at least it used to be. The old farmhouse stood like a ghost at the edge of the hill, its paint long since stripped by time and betrayal. I hadn't been here in 12 years. Not since the day we buried him. Now I was back, and I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Grandpa used to say, "Land doesn't die, it remembers," and that morning, I felt it remembering me. The wind carried the smell of damp soil and pine, the same smell that used to cling to his coat when he'd come home after working sunrise to sunset on the farm. But now, where fields once grew wheat and sunflowers, stood tall steel fences with sharp warnings, private property, high pines resort development behind the fences. I could see white luxury cabins, half-built swimming pools, and trucks moving dirt like ants on a carcass, a resort, on his land. I parked my truck in the same dirt spot where his tractor used to sit. The farmhouse door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing dust-covered furniture and a single framed photo on the wall. My grandfather standing proudly in front of a red barn, holding the deed to his farm. That photo was dated 1983. Below it, on the floor lay a small wooden box half buried in dust and spiderwebs. Inside were yellowed papers, receipts, and envelopes stamped HOA of High Pines Valley. Each one told the same story: threats, fines, and dues that kept increasing until he was forced to sell his land just to pay them off. But tucked in the very back of that box was something different. Survey map. Not the kind printed by a small-town HOA. This one was government-issued, sealed, and notarized. And it showed a red line, marking the boundaries of the property my grandfather never actually lost. The sale, the transfer, it was all a lie. They never bought it. They stole it. I turned the map over. On the back, in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, were 6 words. "If you're reading this, fight back." For a moment I just stared at those words, the old man's ghost whispering through every letter. And then I saw the signature on the bottom of the map, the notary seal of the county registrar, and a date that froze my blood. July 7th, 2013. That was 2 weeks after he died. My chest tightened. The HOA hadn't just extorted him. They had faked documents after his death to claim his land, and built a multi-million-dollar resort on it. And the name listed as HOA president on those papers? Daniel K. Mercer. I knew that name. He was the same man who stood in front of City Council on TV last month, bragging about sustainable resort expansion and community partnerships. He called it the crown jewel of High Pines. But I knew better. It was built on bones, my grandfather's legacy buried under concrete and greed. That night I set up a small camp inside the farmhouse. I couldn't sleep. My mind played memories like broken film reels. Grandpa sitting by the fireplace teaching me how to read maps, telling me about his dream of building a ranch for families who couldn't afford city vacations. He called it the People's Valley. Now, the same land was turning into a playground for the wealthy, owned by the same HOA that had destroyed him. I stared at the map again, tracing the red lines with my finger, and realized something else. The coordinates didn't just mark the farm, they extended another mile north, into what was now the resort's main property. The cabins, the pool, the parking lot, all of it. Every inch of that resort sat on land that legally belonged to my family. At sunrise, I drove down to the town archives. The clerk, an older woman with glasses slipping down her nose, recognized my last name immediately. "Adler," she said softly. "You're Tom's grandson, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." Her face fell. "Your grandfather was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened." I slid the survey map across the counter. "Can you tell me if this land was ever legally transferred?" She looked at it, adjusted her glasses, and frowned. "Strange," she murmured. "According to county records, this property is still under the Adler Trust. It was never signed over." I leaned forward. "Then how did the HOA?" She looked up sharply. "They filed a false title claim. By afternoon, I had a flash drive full of files, photos, and property logs. I sat in my truck scrolling through them, heart pounding harder with each click. Emails between Mercer and county officials. Secret transactions. Shell companies. Even construction permits backdated before the land was sold. It was all there. And then one file, A scanned letter marked confidential caught my eye. Ensure that the Adler acquisition remains off record. Resort groundbreaking proceeds. July 2014. HOA funds to be reimbursed once resort revenue stabilizes. D. Mercer. My hands clenched around the steering wheel. They used HOA funds, the same dues they extorted from families across the valley, to finance the theft of my grandfather's farm. That evening, I drove to the construction site. The gate was guarded by 2 security men in black jackets with High Pines Resort logos. When they stopped me, I flashed a badge, and not the kind they'd expect. Environmental Compliance Division, I said calmly. Routine inspection. They stepped aside. Inside, I walked the dirt paths between the new cabins, watching bulldozers tear through what used to be his wheat fields. Every sound of metal scraping against soil felt like a scream. And then, through the haze of dust and diesel fumes, I saw it. A massive sign being installed near the entrance. Coming soon. Adler, Springs Resort and Spa. They'd even stolen his name. The rage inside me went still, cold and focused. They thought the Adler name would make the resort sound rustic and local. They didn't know it would mark the end of them, because they hadn't stolen from just any farmer's grandson. They'd stolen from someone who'd spent the last 10 years working as a federal land fraud investigator. I stared at that sign, the letters gleaming under the setting sun, and made a promise to the wind that carried his memory. They took your land, Grandpa. Now I'll take everything they built on it. The next morning, I drove out to what used to be the county's public records office. But when I got there, I found a new polished sign on the brick building. High Pines Homeowners Association, Regional Headquarters. My jaw tightened. The very people who destroyed my grandfather's life had turned the public record hall into their own headquarters. They'd buried the evidence right where it used to live. Inside, the air smelled like pine cleaner and corruption. The front desk receptionist looked up with a polite but guarded smile. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yeah," I said, holding up an old file folder. "I'm here for HOA case records from the early 2000s, name Thomas Adler." Her smile faltered. "That's an old one. Good. Then it should be easy to find." She hesitated. "We usually don't, ma'am," I interrupted softly, leaning in. "This is a federal audit request. You can either hand me the archives or I can come back with a warrant." That did it. She disappeared into the back. 15 minutes later, she returned with a cardboard box marked Archived Dispute Files. Inside were handwritten notes, payment slips, and certified letters with bold red stamps across the top. Final notice. Show assessment due. The first was for $200. The last was for $2,300. Each fine was accompanied by vague language. Unauthorized structure, non-compliant fencing, failure to maintain soil integrity. All lies. All pressure. Tactics. I flipped through the stack until I found one envelope dated June 3rd, 2013. 2 weeks before he died, he'd written a short note on the back of it in his slanted handwriting. "Can't pay what I don't owe. If they want my land, they'll have to bury me with it." My throat tightened. I could almost hear his voice again, stubborn, proud, and unyielding. That's who Thomas Adler was, the kind of man who believed that justice didn't need lawyers or headlines, just truth. And truth had killed him. Later that day, I drove to Marion, the neighboring town. That's where Carl Jennings lived, the old surveyor who used to work for the county. He was the one my grandfather trusted most. Carl's place looked frozen in time. Rusted mailbox, a porch covered in empty coffee mugs, and a yard full of survey stakes and faded blueprints. When I knocked, he opened the door with a cane in one hand and suspicion in his eyes. "Who's asking?" "Evan Adler, Tom's grandson." He stared for a moment before a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. You've got his eyes." He motioned me inside, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and sat across from me. "So the old man's land, huh? You're finally looking into that mess?" "I found the old survey maps," I said, pulling them from my bag. "And something tells me the HOA did more than just overcharge him." Carl laughed bitterly. "Son, they didn't overcharge him. They bled him." He leaned back, staring into the distance as if he could still see the past. "Your granddad came to me in 2009, he said. Said the HOA kept fining him for things that didn't exist. Missing fence panels, drainage violations, noise complaints. Nonsense. He thought it'd stop if he paid the first fine. But it never did. Carl took a long sip of coffee. They found out he was sitting on over 400 acres of prime creekfront property. That land was worth millions if rezoned. And the HOA? They had big friends. Developers who saw dollar signs where he saw soil. He pulled out a file folder of his own, faded brown one with Adler Farm written on the front. These are the original survey grids, he said, spreading them on the table. This here, he pointed to a shaded section. That's the resort's pool area. All of it sits square on Adler-owned coordinates. They never bought it, Evan. They forged the transfer. I ran a hand through my hair. I mean they used your grandpa's signature after he died, Carl said flatly. And the county clerk at the time? A man named Mercer. Same one running the HOA now. My jaw tightened. Daniel Mercer, Carl nodded. He was just starting out back then. Smart, ruthless. He saw an old man on valuable land and thought nobody'd notice if he pushed him off it. He slid another paper across the table. A property line release form with 2 signatures. One was my grandfather's. The other was Mercer's, except my grandfather's signature was missing something. His looped R and a flourish he always used. This one was forged and clean, mechanical. He died on June 21st, Carl said. This form was notarized on June 28th. Silence filled the room. Why didn't you come forward? I asked quietly. Carl sighed, eyes heavy with guilt. I tried. Went to the county attorney. They told me to drop it. Next week, my office burned down. Lost half my records. After that, I figured it wasn't worth dying over. He looked up, voice trembling slightly. But maybe it is now. I nodded slowly. It is. That evening, I returned to the farmhouse. The wind howled against the windows and the old wooden floors groaned beneath my boots. I spread all the documents across the kitchen table. Survey maps, forged deeds and fake HOA invoices, until the surface was covered in the history of a crime that spanned over a decade. Each paper felt like a piece of him and the man who had built this place with his bare hands. I played an old voicemail I'd saved from years ago, the last one he'd ever left me before I went off to college. His voice crackled through the static. Don't ever let them tell you this land ain't ours, boy. Dirt remembers who took care of it. Those words hit harder now than they ever had because the dirt did remember. And soon, the world would too. 2 days later, I filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. Within hours, my federal credentials opened doors that had been sealed shut for years. Emails, bank transfers, meeting notes. All roads led back to the same man, Mercer. He'd built his entire empire on stolen land, financed by HOA fines, and funneled through fake improvement funds that never actually reached the neighborhoods they'd been laundering millions under the guise of community development. And the resort, it wasn't just a luxury getaway. It was the cash cow to clean their stolen money. But before I could move forward, I needed one last piece, the original deed. The one locked away when the HOA acquired the farm. So that night I returned to the headquarters. Not as a visitor this time. The back door lock was still the same model my grandfather had used on the barn. I picked it in seconds. Inside, the office was silent, lit only by the hum of security screens and the faint tick of a clock. I moved fast. Up the stairs. Down the hall marked records a private. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched like cold metal tombstones. I searched through drawers until I found the one marked AC, and there it was. Adler Trust. Original deed. Filed 1978. The real one. I pulled it out, the original county seal still intact, and smiled for the first time in days. Then I took photos of every page and slid it back exactly where I'd found it. Because the fight wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. About burning their lies in the same sunlight that used to warm this valley. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. A voice said, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. Out of the shadows stepped Daniel Mercer himself. Crisp suit, smug grin, eyes full of arrogance. Well, he said. The Adler boy. I wondered when you'd come sniffing around. I didn't flinch. You built your empire on my grandfather's grave. He smiled faintly. No, I built it on opportunity. He didn't understand progress. You can't cling to the past forever. Progress? I said quietly. You call theft progress? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't know who you're dealing with." I smiled back, calm and deliberate. "Actually, Mercer, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And now the feds will too." His grin faltered for the first time. I walked past him and out the door without another word. The next morning, I uploaded every file, every map, and every forged signature to an encrypted federal database. A name glowed on my screen as I hit send. Operation Ground Truth. This was no longer personal. It was official. And for the first time in 12 years, I looked out over the valley and felt my grandfather's presence, not as a memory, but as momentum, because the past was no longer buried, it was about to rise. Rain came down hard that morning, sheets of silver slicing across the valley. By the time I reached the ridge overlooking the resort, the once golden farmland was a swamp of mud and machinery. But even through the storm, the massive banner was visible. Grand opening, Adler Springs Resort and Spa. A Mercer development. My name. His pride. Both standing where my grandfather's barn once did. I wasn't here to watch. I was here to finish what he started. The night before, my encrypted file transfer had triggered an automated review at the Department of Land and Resource Integrity, the federal unit I worked for under a cover alias. By dawn, an investigation order had been quietly approved, but the bureaucratic gears turned slow. And Mercer was opening his resort today, so I planned something quicker, something personal. I zipped my jacket against the wind, checked the small recording device clipped inside my collar, and started down the slope. Music thundered from the stage as I walked into the crowd. Champagne glasses, umbrellas, and glossy smiles under white tents. Local reporters, investors, county officials, all here to celebrate the grand lie. Mercer stood at the podium, shaking hands with a state representative. He looked untouchable, every inch the polished visionary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the mic, voice booming through the speakers. "Today marks a new beginning for High Pines Valley, a future of progress, community, and prosperity." The crowd applauded. I slipped closer through the bodies until I stood just 10 feet from him. He didn't recognize me at first. I looked like any other contractor. But when our eyes met, I saw a flicker of recognition. Then a smirk. He continued, "This resort represents not only luxury but unity, the kind of unity that," I cut him off, "was built on stolen land." The microphone feedback screeched. Every head turned. Silence. Then murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mercer's smile stiffened. "Excuse me?" I stepped up onto the edge of the stage, rain dripping from my hair. "You heard me. This land belonged to Thomas Adler, my grandfather. You forged his signature and built your empire on his grave." Gasps. Cameras shifted toward us. "Security," Mercer said quietly. 2 guards moved forward, but I raised a small voice recorder high in the air. "Before you do that, maybe you should hear the tape of Mercer's meeting from 2013, the one where he told the county clerk to lose the Adler deed." The crowd's noise grew louder. Reporters lifted their phones. I pressed play. Mercer, recording. "He's old. He'll fold. Once he's gone, we'll file the transfer. No one will check. The farm's perfect for development." Unknown voice. "What about the surveyor?" Mercer, "Handle it." Everyone has a price. The air crackled. Even the rain seemed to pause. Mercer lunged forward. "That's fake." But I was ready. I dropped the recorder into the hands of the nearest reporter and pulled out my phone, projecting the scanned deed onto the big LED screen behind the stage, the one meant to show his ribbon-cutting ceremony. The screen flickered, then displayed the forged document, his signature glowing under the spotlight. Next to it, I showed the original deed signed by my grandfather, the same county seal, same date, but no transfer. 2 images. One truth. The crowd exploded with noise, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, people pulling out phones. "Mr. Mercer," someone yelled. "Is this forgery?" He stammered. That's confidential material." "Then how do I have it?" I said. He turned toward me, voice rising. "You broke into my office." I stepped closer. "You broke into my family's life. You used his death to steal everything he built." The tension broke like a snapped wire. Suddenly, one of the reporters screamed, and all eyes turned toward the back of the stage where a black SUV screeched to a stop. 3 federal agents stepped out, jackets marked LFRI, Land Fraud and Resource Integrity Division. My division. The lead agent, a woman with a tight bun and calm authority, held up her badge. Daniel K. Mercer. Under investigation for federal land fraud, falsification of legal documents and misuse of HOA funds. Step away from the podium. Mercer's face drained of color. This is insane. You can't, she cut him off. We have your voice recording, your forged transfers, and bank records connecting HOA funds to offshore accounts. He turned to me, fury trembling through his voice. You set me up, I smiled. No, you set yourself up. I just hit record. As the agents moved in, Mercer tried one last desperate card. He grabbed the mic. This man isn't a victim, he's a fraud. He's been planning this for years. I took the mic gently from his hand and spoke into it, calm and steady. My name is Evan Thomas Adler, federal land investigator, grandson of the man whose name you used to sell your lies. And today, Mr. Mercer, you're standing on federal evidence. The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted. Agents handcuffed Mercer, reading him his rights over the sound of thunder. The rain came harder now, drenching everyone, washing the dust of corruption off the valley floor. Hours later, the resort grounds were empty. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Trucks idled as federal teams documented every inch, confiscating files, computers, financial ledgers. I walked through the half-built lobby, the smell of wet wood and cement filling the air. The giant letters ADLER still hung across the front desk. It felt surreal, seeing my family name twisted into a logo for greed. I touched the cold metal letters and whispered, You'll get your name back, Grandpa, I promise. A week later, the news exploded nationwide. President arrested for massive land fraud scheme. Resort built on stolen family property. Federal investigation underway. Local hero exposes 12-year corruption network. The HOA board scattered like rats, half of them resigning overnight, the others scrambling for lawyers. But I wasn't done, because behind every corrupt leader is a chain of accomplices, bankers, notaries, even county officials who looked the other way. And I was going to drag every single one into the light. That's when the messages started coming. From families across the valley. Hundreds of them. Each had a story. Overcharged fees, false fines, threats, forced sales. The HOA had been bleeding them for years. They all ended their messages the same way. If Tom Adler could stand up to them, maybe we can too. Those words hit me harder than any victory. My grandfather's fight, the one they thought they'd buried, had come back stronger, louder, unstoppable. Then one night I got a call from Carl Jennings. You did it, boy, he said, his old voice shaking. They're talking about returning the land, about dissolving the HOA altogether. I smiled. It's not over yet. He chuckled softly. Your granddad would be proud. But be careful. Mercer's not the only one who wanted that land. I frowned. What do you mean? There's more to this valley than dirt and deeds, Carl said. Developers are sharks. When one bleeds, the others circle. He hung up before I could answer. The next morning I drove out to the resort again, now sealed off under federal order. Fog rolled across the hills and the air smelled like wet cedar, but something felt off. A black sedan was parked near the gate. A man stood beside it wearing a gray suit and a quiet smile. He introduced himself simply. Mr. Adler, name's Rhodes. I represent a group of private investors interested in purchasing the property once it's cleared. I studied him. You mean the land my grandfather owned? He smiled thinly. Let's not get sentimental. You've done impressive work. But land like this doesn't sit idle. When the case closes, it'll go to the highest bidder, unless you'd prefer to cooperate. Cooperate? Sell it now. We'll make sure the transition goes smoothly. No red tape, no noise. You'll walk away with more than your grandfather ever dreamed of. I took a step closer, meeting his eyes. My grandfather didn't dream of money. He dreamed of honesty. Rhodes sighed. That's a shame. Honesty doesn't pay as well. He got back into the car and drove off, taillights fading into the mist. That was the moment I realized something. This fight wasn't just about my family anymore. The corruption didn't end with Mercer. It went deeper, wider, older. And if I didn't stop it, the next Mercer would just take his place. So I made a decision that night. One that would change everything. I wasn't going to sell the land. I was going to restore it, rebuild the farm, replant the fields. turn the valley into something no corporation could ever own again, a public trust in my grandfather's name. The world had seen enough stolen land. It was time someone gave some back. As the sun rose the next morning, I stood at the edge of the property, boots in the mud, hands in my pockets. The wind carried the same scent of pine and earth I remembered as a boy. For the first time in 12 years, the valley was quiet. No engines, no hammering, just peace. But I knew it wouldn't last, because power doesn't die easy. And if Mercer's empire had fallen, the people behind him would be coming next. The investors, the banks, the ones who made a fortune off every stolen acre. They'd come for me and I'd be waiting. The valley was silent again. But silence can be dangerous, and it hides what's waiting underneath. 3 weeks had passed since Mercer's arrest. The resort gates remained sealed, guarded by federal agents. The town's newspapers called it the Fall of High Pines, but I knew better. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something deeper and darker. I sat inside my grandfather's farmhouse, surrounded by documents. The kitchen table, once covered with maps and seed catalogs, was now buried in legal files. Mercer was in custody, but the Federal Review revealed new names. Bankers, developers, even 2 state officials who had signed off on the forged transfers. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern repeated. The HOA was just the mask. Behind it sat a web of investors tied to Summit Development Group, a corporation that had funded more than a dozen community projects across 3 states. Each one involved land disputes, forced sales, and resort acquisitions. They weren't building communities. They were buying silence. That's when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A smooth, calm voice spoke. Mr. Adler, I assume you know who we are. It was Rhodes, the investor I'd met at the gate. He continued. We've been following your investigation. You've caused quite a stir. But this doesn't have to end badly. I said nothing. Let's be honest, he went on. You're a federal agent. We're businessmen. You have evidence, we have resources. There's room for understanding. Sign a confidentiality agreement. Walk away with $5 million. Let the land go back to progress. I let his words hang in the air before answering quietly. Progress built on graves isn't progress. It's rot. He chuckled softly. You sound like your grandfather. Thanks, I said, and ended the call. That night, I opened my laptop and drafted a report that would change everything. A full investigative summary, connecting every fake sale, every shell company, every state official on the take. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. The file name was simple. Adler report.pdf. When I hit send, it went directly to 3 places: the Department of Justice, the U.S. Land Authority, and every major newspaper outlet I could find. By dawn, it was public. The next morning, the news broke nationwide. Front-page headline screamed, Federal Report Exposes Multi-State Land Fraud Ring. Developers, politicians implicated in resort scheme. Adler whistleblower reveals hidden corruption network. Within 48 hours, arrests began. Offices raided. Accounts frozen. Summit Development's CEO was indicted on federal charges. And Mercer? He took a plea deal in exchange for testifying against everyone above him. The man who once called himself the face of progress was now just another witness in handcuffs. But even as justice rolled through the system, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Mercer's arrest hadn't brought peace. Not yet, because the land, my grandfather's land, still stood empty. Fenced, guarded, forgotten. And I realized that justice isn't complete until you rebuild what was destroyed. So I went to court, not as an agent, but as a grandson. I filed a motion to reclaim the property under the Adler family trust, backed by the original 1978 deed. The hearing lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the judge looked down at the paperwork and said the words I'd waited 12 years to hear. By authority of the State Land Office, full ownership of the property known as High Pines Valley is hereby restored to the Adler estate. I didn't smile. I just exhaled, slow, heavy, and long. It was over. But then the judge added one more line that caught me off guard. Given the whistleblower's actions and federal service, this land may be converted to a protected trust in perpetuity, at the discretion of the estate. That's when it hit me. I could make this permanent. No more ownership battles. No more greed. No more lies. A legacy that couldn't be bought again. 2 months later, the valley came alive again, not with bulldozers, but with people. Families, local farmers, volunteers. Together, we cleared the broken fences, reseeded the fields, rebuilt the barn. We called it Adler Community Reserve. Part farm, part nature preserve, part memory. Kids ran where tractors once worked. Wildflowers grew where steel beams once stood. The land finally was free. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the ridge, I stood beside the rebuilt red barn. The same spot from the photo in my grandfather's old frame. Carl Jennings was there too, leaning on his cane. He looked at the horizon and smiled. Never thought I'd live to see this place breathe again. I handed him a folded piece of paper, the official deed transfer for the Adler Community Trust. It wasn't in my name. It was in everyone's. He opened it slowly, eyes glistening. "You're giving it away?" I nodded. That's what he wanted all along. He didn't want to own it. He wanted to share it. Carl chuckled softly. "You've got his stubborn streak," I smiled. "Guess it runs in the soil." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch. The stars stretched across the sky, clear and endless. The crickets sang in the tall grass just like they used to when I was a boy. I pulled the old wooden box from beside the chair, the one I'd found that first day. Inside it, next to the faded letters, was my grandfather's pocket knife. On the handle, carved faintly, were the words, "Fight for what remembers you." I closed my hand around it and whispered to the wind, "I did, Grandpa. And now they'll remember us too." The next morning, as dawn broke over the valley, sunlight caught on something new, a wooden sign at the edge of the property. Freshly carved letters read, "Adler Valley Community Trust. Dedicated to the people who protect the land, and the land that protects them." Underneath, a smaller line read, "Established in honor of Thomas Adler, 1929-2013. Months later, the headlines faded. The world moved on. But here, the valley stayed alive. Every harvest, every sunrise, every voice of laughter echoing off the hills. They weren't just memories anymore. They were proof that truth can take root even after fire, because what was once stolen had been restored. Not just the land, but dignity, legacy, hope. And as I walked through the fields that evening, soil soft under my boots, I realized something my grandfather must have always known. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. That's how it ended. Not with revenge, but renewal. The HOA was gone. The resort erased. The valley reborn. And the Adler name? It no longer stood for loss. It stood for something much stronger. End of story. HOA extorted $450,000 from my grandfather's farm. Didn't know they built a resort on my land.